Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Good Insights podcast from the Good Project. This is Danny Mucinskas again, a senior project manager at the Good Project. Today, I'm excited to have with me Nick Haisman-Smith, who is the executive director and co-founder of the Institute for Social and Emotional Learning. So, Nick, welcome to the podcast. Excited to have you with us today.
Thanks, Danny. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. So I'm just going to read out a little bit about you. So Nick Haisman-Smith, him, is the executive director and co-founder, as I said, of the Institute for Social and Emotional Learning and a doctoral researcher at the University of Bristol, focusing on social and emotional learning and educator well-being. Nick's passion for SEL stems from his experiences working with upper elementary through to high school students and families in the UK, South Africa, and the USA. He has presented and run workshops for schools, school districts, universities, and conferences around the world, including the Sunday Times Festival of Education and talks at Google. Nick works with schools around the world and lives in Cambridge, UK with his husband and daughter. Nick, so excited to delve a little bit more into your experience and your expertise today. To get us started, can you tell us a little bit more about what spurred you or what motivated you to get involved with this field of social emotional learning and also to launch the Institute for SEL?
Yeah, you bet. I'd be happy to share a little about that story. And maybe I could zoom back in time to young teacher Nick working in my first school in central London at the age of 23, 24, and noticing that the amazing young people I had the privilege of working with and teaching had so many beautiful gifts and talents and strengths. But one issue and one real recurring theme from that time teaching was that the social emotional needs of these brilliant young people, their own well-being was a real area for concern. And in London at that time, we were really in a place of being very responsive and reactive when there were issues, when students were showing signs of distress or mental health worries, and we didn't have a lot in place to prevent or to take proactive steps to support the healthy social emotional development of young people. And as a young teacher, I was sort of scratching my head thinking, why are we waiting for things to get difficult for these folks rather than trying to provide them with skills and support across the board for all kids in advance? That really led me to a research curiosity. I taught in London for a number of years and in the UK before applying to come to the US for graduate school, and was very lucky to get a place at Stanford to study social emotional learning and practices around well-being in different school systems around the world. And that's where I really had this time to look at other practices, different ways of designing school that prioritized this intentional, proactive approach to social emotional development in young people. So fast forward a few years after that research period, and I found myself very fortunately to be hired by the Nueva School, which is a wonderful school just outside of San Francisco that had social emotional learning as one of its sort of founding pillars. And I was one of the SEL specialists at Nueva. I was in the middle school, along with my colleagues, Janice Tobin, Rush Sabiston Frank, and Elizabeth McLeod. And the four of us as the SEL specialists for the school were in the right place at the right time. My colleagues had done amazing work in the area for many years. And we sat down together one day and thought, how can we begin to share these practices beyond our classrooms, beyond our work? And the school were very supportive. And we started a little summer conference called the Institute for SEL. And that was in 2009. For a long time, we still kept going with our day jobs, teaching, loving developing lessons with students, learning from them. But over the next few years, the demand for this work really took off, and schools that were looking at systems approaches to SEL, creative practices, really embedding this work into curriculum in a way that fired up kids and got them excited. And they were coming to us for some help and answers. So we now have the huge privilege of working with schools all around the world. We're still a small team, but we've grown and we have a network of associates, and we get to support all different types of schools, public schools across the US, independent schools, boarding schools, and a lot of international schools around the world.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that background and that tour of what really motivated you to get involved in this kind of work. Can I prompt you, I guess, to be a little bit more specific? Many of our listeners will be familiar with social emotional learning as a movement. And when you think about this idea of preparing students for the world and really confronting what's going to help them thrive, what are some of the skills that might fall under the SEL umbrella when we think about what SEL actually is and what it looks like on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, because I think we can talk about it in sort of academic competency language, but actually, what are we really meaning on a day-to-day basis? I think it's really helpful to think of SEL being the dynamic interplay between kind of two sets of competencies. One is our inner world, so our intrapersonal, within ourselves, how we understand who we are, our identity, our emotions, that ability to tune into our inner narrative. And then what do we do with that? How can we manage those feelings? How can we find alignment between the multiple parts of our identities? So that's the intra, within ourselves side of things. The other dimension is what we might talk about being the interpersonal or the relational side of things. And that is, how can I develop skills to tune into the lived experience of someone else, their emotional state, their perspectives, their culture, their background, their identities? And then what skills do I have to build relationships with other people based on those differences, based on similarities? How do I resolve conflict or differences of opinion when those arise in ways that build understanding and build connection? So for us, it's that sort of dynamic interplay between understanding ourselves and managing ourselves and understanding others and forming healthy and positive relationships. And if you take that into a really concrete example, all of us as adults, we're never done with this work, right? We might teach it in schools, but it's a lifelong practice. And for sure, I bet all of our listeners can think of teams that we're part of or groups we're part of where we are challenged to understand ourselves better, to manage our own emotions in particular moments when things happen within our communities or in the news at large. And then how do we really find productive ways to work with people from all different backgrounds and all different perspectives? And I think that's when seeing this as lifelong learning and a practice rather than a destination is actually really inspiring, because it's something that we know we can learn, we get to practice, we know we're going to mess up, we get to try again, and it's about the process and not perfection.
Thank you so much. I think that framework of the intra and the interpersonal aspects of SEL is really helpful, as well as the idea that this doesn't ever really end, that we are all hopefully practicing SEL throughout our lives and learning. When you collaborate with schools, and I know you do a lot of collaboration with schools, what would you say are some of the things that you most often see schools get right about their approach to SEL? And then also on the flip side of that, maybe some advice to some of our listeners. What do they most often misunderstand or get wrong, or could be doing differently, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's hard to generalize because so many different types of school systems and different structures are naturally more or less effective at different elements of implementing SEL. I think what feels really good in thinking about SEL in 2025 is that the vast majority of schools have a really deep belief in the importance of this work now. If I rewind 15 years to when the Institute started, we would spend a good chunk of our first day at our conference just backing up and sharing the research on the importance of SEL. Not to convince, but to really make sure we all had an understanding that this wasn't just something that felt good, but it was actually backed up by some really robust evidence. We don't need to do that now. We really do find that in schools, the willingness is there, the buy-in is there. Schools are really also recognizing that this isn't a nice to have. It's actually a crucial part of what makes schooling effective and meet the needs of students in this day and age. And I think part of the reason that awareness is now so widespread is because of what we all experienced during the pandemic and how we saw that students really needed that sense of connection and social emotional health in order to be able to manage that really difficult time. So that's what schools really get right. The buy-ins there, the recognition. I also think that the vast majority of schools we work with, they have got some of the curriculum side of this work in place. So they'll be using a resource, they'll be pulling something that maybe they've bought or maybe they found on the internet, and they are teaching these skills. What I think is often the place where a school will ask us for help, to your question about what maybe schools could do differently or maybe struggle with, I think the idea that SEL is an approach, first and foremost, to all teaching and learning, to how we design schools, an articulated, sequenced curriculum and program as well. But it's an approach first and foremost. I also think it really does take a lot of nurturing. There are no quick fixes when it comes to this because it's so entangled with school culture, with values, with teacher professional development. So it's not something that it's, buy a new curriculum, do a professional development day, and you're off and running. It takes a lot more attention and nurturing than that. And I think the final part that it's hard for schools because they're busy places. But when we don't take the lens of SEL and use it to analyze our school systems and our structures, as well as the teaching and the curriculum piece, we really miss an opportunity to have that community alignment. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If you think for a moment about all of those systems in schools, from the way we manage behavior and classroom management, the way we organize recess and supervision, the way we organize bus programs, trips, service learning, all of those kind of systems, hiring teachers. If we could bring that SEL lens to all of those systems, we find opportunities to not only reinforce the skills we're teaching to kids, but to really show them. Because if we can show up in our ways we approach discipline and classroom management with a lens of SEL, a focus on relationships, a focus on understanding that all kids are going to make mistakes, they're growing, they are building those skills. If we approach it with that lens, then that's really reinforcing what we've been teaching them in the curriculum. So I think the systems approach to it is often something that's hard to do, but really important. And maybe just my sort of final little add on to that is my big passion in this work is for it to be sustainable because I don't
Mhm.
want schools to see SEL or this work as an initiative, something we do for a couple of years and then leadership changes or the person who really was pushing for the work moves to a different school. So how can we make this work so embedded into the fabric of a school that it is just what the school does, not what a particular leader is leading? And that for me is why the systems work is, I think, so important.
Yeah, so much richness in that answer and thinking about what it really takes to live out SEL day to day in a school. What would you recommend maybe a school take as step one in order to realize a system change? How do you think about maybe guiding a school through that
Yeah.
process? What would you recommend they take as the first step when it can seem so daunting, changing our entire school climate, or
Mm.
how do we figure out how to actually
Yeah.
implement this? I love the ideas, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah. I really encourage schools to start by celebrating what you are doing well and start from a strengths-based approach. So, whether that is you've got your third grade classrooms really fired up and powering along with some beautiful SEL work. Let's celebrate that, shine a spotlight on it, explore why that's been so successful there. With lots of schools, we use the success analysis protocol, where you take this example of something that's working and you dissect it for like what's made it work, who was involved, what things were in place, what communication happened around it, what resources were needed. And then you learn from that sort of successful moment and ripple that out to other places. So I always like to start with what's working well and celebrating it. I also like to celebrate that so many teachers are doing SEL, they might just not see it that way. So, for example, I bet every teacher who listens to this podcast, and probably every teacher in the US, is developing learning opportunities for kids that focus on group learning and collaboration in their classroom. That is SEL, right? We are teaching kids those skills of collaboration. Sure, we could maybe give them some more skills to do that effectively, but the fact you're providing that opportunity and they're learning by doing is SEL. So when we can help teachers see that this isn't another thing on the plate or another sort of distraction from what the core purpose as they perceive it might be, we can really say, we're going to help you do your work better rather than giving you a whole nother thing to do. So I would say that there are some of the starting points. I would also say that finding a tool that can help you as a community reflect on what you're doing is also a really powerful starting point. At IFSEL, we have a free school self-reflection tool or a district self-reflection tool if you're doing it at the district level. It's got a number of questions in there that teams can review together, whether they are at the early stages of pushing SEL in this particular area all the way through to the more advanced stages. And that self-reflection tool is really about building a shared awareness of where a school is at rather than some sort of like formal diagnosis. So the process of completing it helps schools identify, hey, here are like 3 priorities we could focus on as a starting point. But some sort of structured tool like that, I think, can really be helpful. And maybe my final point is for us, and actually the research really backs this up, if we want to advance good social emotional learning outcomes for young people, we know we need to start with the adults first. And what I mean by that is we need to be building a culture of communal care in our schools. We need to be offering professional learning for our teachers that really provides them with resources and strategies to do this work more effectively. And we need to provide that in a way that is really practical and experiential. Because what we know that if we get that bit right, teachers feel more equipped, they feel more confident, and actually they feel like they've had that opportunity to attend to their own needs for connection and well-being, and then go and do that work with kids much more effectively. So I guess that's quite a long list of things I suggest schools start with, but any one of those is a juicy and good starting point.
Yeah, I love all of those suggestions. Thinking about as an educator, what are you already doing? Doing also this kind of school-wide self-reflection that you talked about as a way to really be picking up on the connections to what you might already be achieving as a school and SEL, and then also this kind of experiential model of professional development and really focusing in on community. I think those are all really important and crucial pieces. When you think about that last piece, if I can ask about what experiential or supportive PD might look like, what are some of the features of that kind of model that you see most often that work for teachers as opposed to maybe more traditional PD that might be a little less exciting or a little less robust at actually achieving change in social emotional learning in a school?
Yeah, such a good question. I feel like a couple of the things that I keep front of mind when I'm designing those professional learning opportunities, I can share with you. The first is joy. I don't mean that in some sort of like Instagram real kind of cheesy way, but I feel like this work can be joyful. It can also be hard. It can also bring up a lot. But I feel like providing that opportunity for educators to reconnect with their passion for education and teaching and the joy that can come from working with young people, that's a pretty big hook and usually gets folks fired up. I would say another quality I seek to build into professional learning for teachers is making it really experiential. And I guess an alternative way to describe that is practical. I want teachers to, be scribbling down like loads of things that they could do like the next day in their classroom that are research based and evidence led, but also like low hanging practical things they can try. Because I know as a teacher in the classroom, when I sat in professional development, if I walked out with some really good theory, of course that's important, but I didn't necessarily take that and do anything different the next day in my classroom. So we like to keep it really practical. And I think the third hallmark or characteristic of good PD for me is the space for individual and collective reflection. Because this work brings up a lot for people individually, professionally, but often also personally, providing that space for some introspection and some reflection, but also some sharing and sharing experiences with one another. What that does really activate that sense of community, builds that shared language, that shared experience, which we know does a lot for teacher sense of belonging and teacher connection and efficacy as well. So keep it joyful without making it too Pollyanna, but you know what I mean. Experiential and practical and building that space for reflection.
Those are three great aspects, I think, for all of us to keep in mind as we look at what types of professional learning experiences might be really powerful for ourselves and our colleagues. Pivoting a little bit, I know that you've done a ton of work in many different contexts with many different schools, including internationally. And I'm just wondering, What have you seen as some of the most common threads between the types of schools you've worked with? And also, what have you learned from working in such a diverse set of environments? What do you
Yeah.
distill as takeaways from working on SEL in those types of institutions?
Yeah, it's been just the most enormous privilege to work with schools that have such vibrant and diverse populations and to think about what should SEL look like and feel like in those communities to really meet the needs of the students, the teachers, the parents and caregivers, etc. I think it's probably as important for every listeners to know that the schools that we typically work in internationally are international schools where the student population is pulled from lots of different nationalities and cultures. We don't yet work with many local public or independent schools in different countries where it's a single kind of national culture that's forming the majority of the population of the school. So all that means really is that these international schools are multicultural. They tend to have a fairly transient population, not necessarily a lot of kids staying from kindergarten all the way through to 12th grade, and that the community there is a globally mobile group. In terms of SEL, what that provides a huge opportunity for, which is amazing, is to really bring in the cross-cultural cultural competence side of SEL. I mentioned in that description of SEL as the intersection of the intra and the interpersonal, that all of that work is culturally contextual and understanding your own identities, other people's identities, understanding how to work effectively with people with similar and different life experiences and backgrounds is core SEL practice. So when you have these incredible international schools, you've just got this great opportunity to learn how to do that day in, day out as part of learning and as part of being a kid in these schools. We also know that it really requires teachers in those places to think about building belonging really intentionally, because with a transient culture, it's a constant sort of maintenance project to building that sense of belonging and a shared identity as a school. And it's something that you have to really intentionally work at. Probably more importantly than all of those pieces, though, is that we have to acknowledge that in multicultural settings within the US, internationally, there really is a no one size fits all approach to SEL. And I think the era of, curriculum off a shelf in the olden days, or one size fits all curriculum where you teach this lesson, then this lesson, then that lesson, we know that that doesn't meet the needs of students who don't see themselves represented in the resources, or where the needs of the culture, the local community are such that the curriculum resources need adaptation in order to really be effective. So I think we have to be careful about cultural assumptions when thinking of SEL in international schools, the difference in the ways different cultures express emotion. There's a lot to be thought through and help teachers to understand that, because we know that those norms vary hugely. Even within schools in the US, that's true as well. So maybe I'll give you a couple of examples about really how that can look. We have at the Institute a really important area of work around conflict resolution and teaching adults and young people skills for conflict resolution, right? And probably just even between you and I, Danny, we have very different experiences and comfort levels with conflict. And what we grew up with influences how we perceive conflict now, how it makes us feel. We might be more avoidant. We might be more invested in arguing our point. We might freeze. We may be people pleasers. There are lots of different ways of thinking about how we might respond to conflict. And some of that comes because of our culture. So when we teach conflict resolution in school settings, we've got to really think about who our students are and what are they bringing to that conversation. Because one of the skills of conflict resolution is understanding communication styles. And for a long time, and probably you've been through this kind of training as well, there was assertiveness training, right? How do you learn to speak and advocate and be assertive? And that, of course, is an important skill, and knowing what that assertive communication style is important. But we also need to really help our students know that there is a cultural lens to that as well. And what might be seen in some cultures to be a robust and, self-determined way of communicating assertively that could be very well received and give you respect. In other cultures, that assertive communication can be perceived as being very rude or defiant or not respecting of power structures within those cultures. Just a tiny example. We don't want to send kids home with tools that are then going to really be a clash with their home culture. So, in thinking all through that very carefully with schools, how do we help our students know the differences between different contexts when different communication styles are appropriate or inappropriate and help them become familiar with code switching in those different contexts?
Mm.
So, I know we started that conversation or that answer sort of thinking about international schools, but actually, I think everything I've just said is relevant in schools everywhere because all schools are multicultural and diverse, and we need to be honoring student perspectives and centering student voice in all of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting example with conflict resolution and how to bring in different ways the cultural viewpoints that might be different about what conflict resolution can look like and also what it means to be assertive or be somebody who's a listener in certain ways and what it looks like to really be working through a problem or a challenge together with different
Yeah.
people.
You've just given everybody another beautiful example as well as about listening. Because when you and I are talking, one of the ways I know you're listening is because you give me eye contact, right? And it's another one of those cultural lenses where in other places, eye contact is seen as rude or
Yeah.
confrontational. So yeah, the listening piece you've just brought up exactly. It's just the same as the style of communication. And there's so much to learn about how to teach those skills to young people in a way that sets them up for success. Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree. I was gonna maybe dive in a little bit to one puzzle around this topic. You can, I think, bring in a cultural lens in certain ways, especially as an educator, but you want to do that in a way that doesn't make assumptions and doesn't also put boxes around what you might know about certain cultural expectations from one place to another or one background to another. How do you think about how educators should navigate that challenge in the day to day?
Yeah.
What does that look like? And how can an educator do that successfully? Because I think that can be one of the most tricky things that an educator might face is trying to both be recognizing of where students are coming from, but also not
Yeah.
then assuming.
Assuming. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And actually, my colleague Elizabeth McLeod, I think, has really taught me so much about this work and this thinking. And she has a beautiful line around curiosity and judgment that when we remain curious, our judgment levels usually go down. So I think one of the ways that we can really attend to not generalizing and not making assumptions is just to really remain in that curious space. And even when we think we might have some certainty around a certain dynamic or a particular culture or context, just remaining curious that we may well not. And so focusing on curiosity to bring down judgment. I think the other part of this really is about remaining humble and nurturing that humility that in this work, we are going to make mistakes. We are going to make an assumption or say something that perhaps we didn't mean. We didn't know enough yet about that topic to have made a more effective statement or a more accurate statement. And so remaining humble to say when you get it wrong and owning that feels to me really, really important. And I think where we could build school cultures that allow those mistakes, don't give permission to them, but allow them and allow a path to come back from them. I think that's where we can really see growth.
Amazing. Yeah, I love the focus on those two character strengths of curiosity and humility and how to embody them day to day. I think that those are so important. Thinking about, I guess, good work a little bit, that is what we focus on at the Good Project. And as you know, I think we have this three-part framework of good work occurring at the intersection of excellence. So this idea of technical proficiency, ethics or social responsibility, making sure that you're doing good for others, and then engagement, finding a sense of personal meaning or connection in what you do. What do you think it looks like to do or to embody SEL, social emotional learning, in ways that are excellent, ethical, or engaging? And I know that there's a lot that you could probably pick up in that question, but what are some of your initial thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll be honest and say this is the first time I've been able or thought about SEL in that through the lens of these but it's been a joy to begin to think about it. So some emerging thoughts. I think one thing it's important to say up front is that, SEL is in the news as a practice in education where there has been some pushback. And in certain places in the US and internationally, there are some questions being asked, some of which are totally fair and need to be asked, others of which are misguided or misunderstanding really what SEL is. So one of the real beliefs that we have as a team at the Institute is that SEL isn't about a particular set of values or beliefs, but it's about helping students and teachers understand their own, make informed choices, understand and celebrate others, and have strategies to kind of live and work effectively with other people of all different values, of all different belief systems. So when I then think about what does it mean to think about excellence and social emotional learning, SEL isn't about lowering standards or, softy, touchy feely. We know the evidence is really behind if you invest in social emotional learning, you have much better social emotional outcomes, academic outcomes for kids. So actually, SEL is about creating a culture and conditions where excellence can flourish and young people can really reach their full potential and removing some of the barriers that can inhibit excellence in all its forms. The ethics part, it's interesting. When we were talking about the competencies, one of the SEL competencies is around ethical decision making, and absolutely, it's about using all of the other competencies, our understanding of ourselves, understanding of others, to make good choices that are ethical, that improve your life, improve the life of those around you, and improve your environment, the world around you as well. And I think an area of work that we are really, I think, pioneering is the intersection between social emotional learning and environmental sustainability and how they really are very connected. And I think of all the challenges in the world we're facing right now, I think climate change and environmental sustainability is probably up there with the most important and the most critical. And I think there's a lot around ethical decision making, social emotional learning, and the environment that we could bring together and have a better understanding of how to support students to be successful in carving a path forward. Engagement is your final E. This was probably in some ways, easiest to think about, but also in some ways the hardest because engaging young people in this work isn't always straightforward. You will have worked with teenagers, Danny. I spent a lot of my career working with adolescents. And, sometimes talking about this stuff with kids, they might have a few eye rolls. There might be
Hmm.
some skepticism. And that is a beautiful quality that I would want to nurture in young people. Why is this relevant to them? Why is this something that they should pay attention to? And it's on us as educators to find really authentic, real life opportunities. It's an easy thing to talk about. It can sometimes be a really hard thing to do. And it kind of comes back to one of our beliefs around experiential learning that if we want to have this work really land for kids, we've got to have them do it, not just lecture them or talk to them about it. It's got to be something embodied and active for them.
Such a powerful set of reflections there, I think, between authenticity. I really like actually the focus on environmental sustainability and choice. I think that that's so important and is something I would love to see the Good Project and our team focus a little bit more on. And I think you've picked up on exactly why and how important that is for the future. And then also SEL being about maintaining high standards. It's not just about soft skills or being touchy-feely, but really about making sure that each one of us can succeed. And we know from the evidence that having SEL competencies can really help each one of us to do that. So I really like the way that you walked through each one of the three E's, and I think that that's a great set of reflections. When you think about your vision for what the effects of SEL should be on society and what we hope if SEL were prioritized more, what society would look like, what's that vision for you? What does that look like? And what kind of effects would we hope that we'll see from incorporating SEL more into schools? What's your hoped for vision for what that will result in society at large?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to only pick a few because I deeply feel that SEL has the power to transform so many dimensions of schooling and society at large. But if I have to pick a few, for me, supporting young people and educators to build a healthier relationship with ourselves, our own identities, who we are, the way we experience emotion, where we feel those emotions, how we manage those emotions. If we could shift and build greater comfort and skills in that dimension for all of us, I think we would see a pretty radical transformation in the way folks are able to show up for themselves, motivate themselves, thrive in whatever parts of their lives they're working on. And I think that then leads me into the second point, which is then around the relationships with others. I have a hope and a vision and a dream, I guess, that with the skills that SEL can offer as a society, we can be much better listeners and really listen without judgment. What's that great phrase? Listen for understanding, not listen to respond. And that alone, I think, could really change the world. And I think it's hard and it needs practice. But if we could shift even just a little bit in that direction, I think it would build more social trust, cohesion, bring down some of those barriers. And the word that gets thrown around a lot at the moment is the polarization. But I think we could be much less polarized if we paused and listened. And I'm going to come back to the bigger picture point that we've connected on around environmental change and our healthier relationship with the planet. Again, I feel like if these skills are more widespread and we have a greater awareness of the interconnectedness of humanity, I really do think we would make different choices when it comes to how we use the resources on this planet and how we protect them. So I kind of just did the intra, inter, and enviro-personal as a triptych, but I do think those are my three sort of hopes or visions.
Great. I think there's so many challenges in the world at the moment, and it's easy to see how SEL can help us confront and hopefully overcome those challenges as we look towards the future. So I think you've picked up on a few of those that are probably the most important as we look around the world. I want to conclude with just a fun question that we've asked many of our guests, and that is, what's something that you have read recently that you found to be thought-provoking or inspiring in a certain way that you would recommend to others who might be listening?
Dan, as you know, I am unable to pick just one thing. You will have seen that throughout the podcast. So I've picked two books. The first one is a book called Restorative Practice by Mark Finnis, a British author who has got a really practical guide into how to implement restorative practices in schools. It's an area of work that has really taken off. A lot of schools this year are asking us for help with looking at their behavior management, classroom management, discipline systems, and bringing them from maybe a more punitive or, traditional mode to a more relationships focused mode. So that's the first book. The second one actually goes along with that beautifully, which is called Connections Over Compliance by Laurie Desort. And it is a book that looks at the neuroscience behind the importance of relationships and connection in schools. And sort of by association, then why restorative approaches in schools are so important. So the neuroscience behind restorative practices. And it's fascinating. The subtitle for the book is Rewiring Our Perceptions of Discipline. And it's one of those books about neuroscience that's very accessible to laymen like me.
I will have to pick both of those up myself, and I hope that some of our listeners might also be interested in picking up either or both of those books as well, based on your recommendation. I think that that concludes our conversation for the moment. Nick, I'm so grateful to you for taking the time to take part in this really wide-ranging conversation about social emotional learning and really education as a whole as we think about some of our hopes for the future and what we've seen and learned from working with schools. And I really just want to thank you again for taking the time to take part in this podcast.
Absolute pleasure, Danny. Thank you so much. And we look forward to having you on SEL Cast at some point in the future.
Great, would love to. And thanks to all of our listeners. We'll see you next time.